In 1939, the ferocity of Hitler's attack caught Europe unprepared. The sheer speed of the Nazi advance, undertaken with a lethal combination of air and land forces, left country after country in disarray. This World War looked nothing like the last.
World War II is really the technology war. It's really quite a race, and the side that's going to win this race is really going to win the war.
By combining and coordinating his forces, Adolf Hitler had created a complete battle system. Using radios, his warplanes, tanks, and infantry divisions were in constant communication. His commanders worked together to roll out a fast-moving wave of terror. The system was called Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War.
Making the system work is key. And that's what you see in World War II, the development of these great technological systems.
Hitler's unstoppable forces racked up victory after victory until all that stood between them and the total conquest of Europe was a strip of water a little over 20 miles wide. On the other side lay England. The Nazi warplanes didn't take long to breach the channel and continue their aggressive advance. But the British were expecting them and had been preparing for just such an assault. For decades, they had been quietly building an invisible wall of defense to guard their island nation from aerial attacks. The result was a wall of protection 5 miles high and 600 miles long. It was a system that had been in the works since the very first airplane crossed the English Channel in 1909.
Britain, even during the First World War, had developed the nucleus of a fighter defense system. They had developed a system of ground spotters, dedicated telephone lines going to a central control room which would plot the location of enemy aircraft on a continually updated map, and orders would then go out to fighter units to scramble and attempt to intercept them. But still, if your warning had to come from observers on the ground, it meant enemy aircraft were already over Britain by the time you first got word of them.
The original Observer Corps was Britain's eyes, but it could see only as far as the horizon. So in the 20s, they added ears.
What we've got here, what we're looking at, is an early warning detection system using acoustic methods to pick up the sound of aircraft engines. An operator sat in that little chamber, which was underground then, nice and silenced, and he listened to the point of loudest focus. When he found that place, of course, he could read off the bearings from which the sounds are coming on his equipment. Then they were passed to a central control room.
The system was somewhat effective. On a quiet night, airplane engines could be heard up to 20 miles away.
Plans exist for a chain of these mirrors all around the southeast coast of England. They were going to have one of these big mirrors about every 25 miles, and then in the gaps between, one of the round mirrors.
This expansion made sense in the 20s when planes flew slow enough to make the 20-mile range effective. But by the 1930s, they were reaching speeds of over 300 miles an hour. That meant the warning was only 10 minutes, not enough time to scramble a counterattack. The British needed something better, and in their desperation, they turned to a research scientist who wasn't concerned with enemy aircraft. He was looking for thunderstorms. His name was Robert Watson Watt.
Watson-Watt's expertise was reflecting short-wave radio signals off the ionosphere to measure its height and its depth and its consistency. And one of the things that scientists working in this field had discovered was that every time an aircraft flew over, there tended to be interference.
To test the phenomenon, Watson-Watt borrowed an RAF bomber and set up a flight experiment near a working BBC radio transmitter. It was a test that would change the course of history. Cranfield University in southern England, radar systems expert Clive Alabaster can replicate the results on a smaller scale in his lab. He places a radio transmitter at one end and a receiver at the other. Above them, he hangs a metal aircraft, poised to interfere with the signal as soon as the transmitter is turned on.
There it is. And if I now pull on this string, it's going to move the airplane across the distance between the two antennas. And we can see considerable variation there. At this point, we've got the situation where the signal has gone weak. And now it's considerably stronger. And if I keep pulling, we should see this undulation continue. That loudening and quietening of the signal, that was the presence of the aircraft. That was the key to radar. It meant that radar could indeed detect overflying aircraft.
That simple demonstration sold the concept of radar to the British government. They immediately set out to turn it into an early detection system for enemy aircraft. But they were not the only ones working on the technology.
Radar is not a British invention. Radar was, in fact, invented in 8 different countries during the 1930s, but because in each of these countries it was a military secret, no one knew that the other country was working on radar.
But at that time, Britain had the greatest need for the technology, so they rushed it into service as the final piece of their interlocking air defense system. It was up and running by 1940, ready for Hitler's aerial assault. The German Luftwaffe was in for a surprise as it set out to conquer England from the sky.
The German scientists and engineers, they assumed more or less that they must be ahead of the British when it came to radar technology. But in fact, their radar technology was being used in a much more primitive way for air defense. They misunderstood the nature of the carefully controlled network which the British had set up.
Britain's defense system was codenamed Chain Home. It was comprised of a string of radar stations equipped with overlapping transmitters. Each transmitter had a receiver that could detect aircraft up to 200 miles away. From the radar stations, operators were connected by landlines to a filter room, where information was funneled into central operations.
The fundamental root of this air defense system was the rapid gathering, analysis, and dissemination of information, which then would allow you to direct fighters scrambled from the ground within 15 minutes of initial detection. And this was the miracle that took place from 1935 right to the beginning of the Battle of Britain.
There was no official start to the Battle of Britain, but when Hitler's Luftwaffe struck out across the Channel in August 1940, the British control and command system was ready. Chain Home was about to be put to the test.
We'd only been used to dealing with about 12 aircraft at a time the most. And you got this great big mass on your screen. We had to guess how many there were there.
The Royal Air Force could see the Germans when they were coming. They could keep their planes on the ground, not waste fuel, and then they could be directed to exactly where they needed to be.
The German fighters, on the other hand, were forced to engage over enemy territory, often at the limit of their fuel reserves. Facing heavy losses, the Luftwaffe made it a priority to take out the British early warning system. The Nazi bombers targeted the radar installations.
We were dive bombed August the 18th, and I could hear them coming. And then they started diving, and when they dived, they shriek, those dive bombers, a hideous sound, which is to frighten people anyway before they drop their bombs.
But even when the Luftwaffe destroyed a station, the British had backup portable units that they immediately brought in as replacements.
After we were bombed, we couldn't operate. We then went into the woods at a mobile set, a large caravan with the receiver in, and the other caravan with the transmitter. And if we hadn't have got those, there'd have been a great gap. So they didn't put us out of action.
That was the strength of the chain home system. The Germans couldn't knock it out. So on September 7, 1940, Hitler changed tactics and focused his strikes on London itself. The British stood virtually alone against the German assault. But ironically, the very